My name is Maeve Marshall, and I will be looking at the subgenre alternate world fantasy. I apologize in advance. I did a PowerPoint for this, and I could not figure out the audio no matter how hard I tried, so it is now in iMovie form. Thank you. The setting is in a world or land different from our own, so it could be a planet, it could be a parallel universe, it could be a hidden world. It's just separate from us. There is also typically magical elements in these stories. If there's no magic, there'll be like fantastic elements or things that aren't of our world. Next, there could be social commentary in these ones. Typically, it's shown through the politics, relationship, and social norms of the land. There's also typically a better developed setting than characters, so the focus might be more on the land and what that looks like as opposed to character development. And then the plots are also fairly engaging, usually with complexities that lead to an adventure of sorts, usually a buildings Roman kind of plot. So for this kind of story, you could think of like Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, Inkheart, and other books where a character is immersed in an alternate world and they are learning a new way of being. So the story I chose was The Little Prince, which was written by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which I might have butchered. So comparing this to what I just talked about with the alternate world fantasy, The Little Prince comes from another planet. So as opposed to our main character traveling to a different planet, the Little Prince comes and visits him, and they share their problems, and you learn all about the Little Prince's world and where he comes from. There might not be magic in this story, but there are fantastic elements with the idea of traveling through space and the idea of talking flowers and a talking fox that the prince bonds with. The story is also quite didactic in nature, so it follows that social commentary idea technically, where you're learning and you're looking at what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable and what, say, Antoine wants to change in the world. The characters are fairly developed in this story as opposed to the setting. You do see some fantastic elements with the different planets, and the setting is there, but it is more focused on the ideas and principles that are presented within the story and the characters as opposed to just the setting. There's also a fairly engaging plot with a man flying over African desert, and then crash landing and having to fix his plane before he runs out of water. All the while, he thinks that he's very imaginative and childlike at heart, where the Little Prince comes along and shows that he's not, and this man must get himself out of there and safely home. And the Little Prince wants a friend, and he's going on an adventure for something different. Part of the fantasy elements in this story is through the plot and where the prince travels to in his adventures. So the Little Prince travels from his planet AB612 to planets A325 all the way through A330, then to Earth. So on those 6 planets, he meets different adults, grown men typically, who all, except for one, seem to have jobs that are very pointless, and these men all claim to be busy, or they need to be doing something, or they don't have time, and they aren't living or enjoying life. Whereas the last man, the man who's lighting the lamp on planet A329, the prince sees him as actually doing something important. He lights the lamp, he unlights the lamp to show how each day has passed. And that man is doing something that's unselfish as opposed to the other men who are working for themselves. Now Earth, he finds that it's very lonely there, even with so many people, that there wasn't very much going on, and the adults are, well, grown-ups. They have no imagination, they're not excited, they're not thinking about the war between the lambs and the flowers and how we need to save the flowers from the lambs eating them. It's a different way of looking at how childhood and adulthood mesh together and how they take from one another. The Little Prince is an interesting story because it allows for a continuation of fables as well as fantasy to mix together, where we are learning from the experiences of those in the story, but we are also exposed to these fantastic elements that we don't get to see in our everyday lives. So the story also looks deeper at the idea of what is the point of life, which might be too big of a question to ask children. However, the story manages to search for that answer as the prince travels and meets other people and considers what he's doing where he wants to be and where he needs to be. So why is this book important for our class in particular? So this story, like I said in the slide before, ties fables and fantasy together. It's also how the plot fits in with other children's books. So we've talked a lot about Bildungsroman and how basically you start off with a character at home and home isn't great, they leave, and then eventually they come back to home and home is better. Well, the little prince does this as he leaves his home planet to find a better planet, to find friends and do other things. So he's not just with this sad flower that was his only friend. But by the end of it, the story, he leaves, and we don't know for sure if he went home, but you have a pretty good feeling that he did go home. This story is also a classic story. It's one of our modern fables that I think is important to consider in teaching, because we need to think about what is important to modern people and what is important to, say, the French, because this book is written by a French author. And we also need to think about whether our author is putting his own values into it, which is my fourth point, that it ties in cultural values because it is a fable and because it is a classic story. So it all meshes together. The story also has a great impact because as you look at it, it makes you ask questions. What does it mean to grow up? What part of my childhood should I carry with me? How can I continue to be curious? How can I continue to look at the world with a sense of wonder? As an adult, it can be pretty hard to look at things that way, and it might seem pointless as, you're too busy, as so is the businessman in the story. But it's important to consider the small things and the fantastic things, and that's what the Little Prince brings into things. He brings in the idea that the key to life and the key to happiness isn't about just being busy. It's about finding things that you enjoy and things that give you a form of responsibility. So I think this book could be very beneficial for us to read in class.